What's going on everybody, I'm Jiffy Nano, and today I wanted to give my thoughts on the upcoming looter shooter, the First Descendant, which recently had its beta test. The First Descendant is a free-to-play, third-person looter shooter akin to games like The Division, Outriders, and the one we'll be drawing the most comparison to, Warframe. Real quick, I wanted to disclose that I am technically a partnered creator with the First Descendant, but that's not going to be affecting my opinion of the game, so with that being said, I actually enjoyed my time in this beta for the most part, but there are a few things that I'm not a huge fan of that I think they could change, and then a few things that are part of the fundamental game design that I'm not really big into, but let's start off with the good stuff. The graphical design of this game is incredible. The power of Unreal 5 is really showing here. The environments, while not really teeming with life, look fantastic. The character models and animations are extremely good. Overall gameplay is very smooth, shooting feels good, and the abilities feel like they have a real impact on the combat. The weapon variety is quite robust, and you can choose from SMGs, ARs, machine guns, beam rifles, shotguns, snipers, hand cannons, pistols, scout rifles, and burst rifles, all with an array of different models, stats, and random passives. So there's a lot of weapons to choose from, and they all felt pretty unique in terms of how and when you would use them. One of the biggest factors, in my opinion, in the success or failure of these games is the game feel, and to me the game felt really good when not suffering from performance issues, but more on that later. The Descendants felt really well designed, all having a different feel and role in combat. All of the abilities felt pretty well thought out and made sense with each character's kit, though some balancing passes may be needed, none of the abilities felt out of place. My only issue with the characters being build potential, but again we'll get into that later. The rune system is really similar to Warframe's mods, and I mean really similar, so it works just as well as it does there. And while we didn't have any access to any of the legendary gear or whatever their highest tier gear is, we don't know what effects they might have, but we did have some of the higher tier runes, and they were pretty interesting, doing things like granting 125% defense when getting kills, or making the first shot after a reload deal 30% more damage. There are 8 different categories of runes that affect different weapons and your character, all having their own rune capacity, so you end up stacking a lot of different runes for different loadouts and weapons. Alright, so let's get into the stuff that I didn't particularly like, but it's not necessarily bad, I'm just not a fan. There are other gear slots that work a lot like rings and amulets that just give you passive stat boosts. These work fine, but personally I just find these kinds of gear slots boring. I wish they were a little more impactful in other ways than just stat passives. Like I mentioned earlier, the characters are all well designed and have different playstyles, but much like Warframe, each character is pretty shallow in its build potential. In Warframe, before the Helminth was added, and admittedly I haven't played since it was added, if you play Excalibur and someone else is playing Excalibur, the difference in your builds you're running is likely pretty minimal. The First Descendant also has this quote-unquote issue, which isn't really an issue, it's just not something I prefer in looter shooters. I tend to prefer games where you can have the same class play wildly different from player to player, and unless the legendary gear completely changes how characters play in the First Descendant, I don't think there's any build variety for any one particular character. Obviously, this is why there are so many different characters, and it's not really a problem, it's just not what I prefer in games like this. Alright, now for the stuff that I think is pretty bad. Performance was abysmal. I have a pretty decent rig, 5th gen Ryzen CPU, RTX 3070, and this game dipped under 30 frames at times and ran around 30 FPS in busy areas for a lot of the time. I have friends who have even better setups than me, and even they were getting pretty low frames, and this is a fixable issue, but as it was during the beta, frame rate stutters and crashes severely hindered my desire to play. Mission variety was also pretty bad. Almost every single mission is go to this spot and kill enemies, and because none of the areas are sectioned off and hidden away like Destiny has done, all these missions felt like patrols that just led you to the next patrol. Not to mention that the environments you're doing these missions in are almost completely empty when not in a mission. I saw a total of maybe 2 or 3 groups of 1 to 3 enemies out in the world not tied to a mission, and that's in all of the areas we had access to. There's no secrets, no Easter eggs, no reason to explore these areas at all. The story was pretty forgettable. In fact, I literally don't remember what was going on for the most part. Some cookie-cutter sci-fi fantasy mumbo-jumbo where the big bad stole a powerful item and is trying to make the world suffer. It was pretty uninspired. The main antagonist looks cool, but is just evil for the sake of being evil. That being said, I don't play games for story, so story being poor doesn't really have any effect on my opinion of this game, but I know some people really care about that, so I wanted it included in the bad section. It's not a good story from what I've played so far. Okay. The big one. The next biggest make or break thing in games like this, along with game feel, is endgame. This section is going to be fairly long, and I'm going to be pretty blunt. I mean this in the nicest way possible, but if the endgame offering on full release is the same as what we had in the beta, this game will not last. There were 3 types of endgame activities, none of them necessarily bad, but not great either. The biggest problem here is that there's only 3 endgame activities. The first two are wave-based survival and defense missions. They play pretty similarly, but survival has you moving around the map to fight waves of enemies, while defense has you defend one spot against waves of enemies. Survival is 10 waves of escalating difficulty moving you from point to point on the map. This was good for high-tier crafting materials, but the difficulty scaling in this was ridiculous. Hopefully this is just a beta thing, but the first 7 waves we were literally one-shotting every enemy, and then on wave 8, it spawned so many unbelievably tanky enemies, I died almost instantly, and every time I would respawn, it would put me in the middle of the group, so I would just die again. The only way we were able to finish all 10 rounds was to have the Descendant with the healing turret in our group, and we literally ran away from the objective and hid in the healing turret until the rounds ended. This has a few obvious problems, first being the difficulty spikes are way too much and max level characters should not struggle that hard in a scenario like that, and second, you don't even have to do the objectives to continue the mission. We literally hid in a corner, in the healing turret, barely killed anything, still beat the mission. The defense missions are almost identical to the Warframe defense missions, where you defend a spot from waves of enemies, and every so many waves, you get a chance to extract with a reward. These are fine, but also had some crazy difficulty spikes in the higher waves. The last endgame activity were void battles. These were big boss battles in a void arena that functioned as like a void fissure type of mission from Warframe. When you finish a survival or defense, you get the chance to obtain an amorphous material. These materials have a colossus tied to them, and you have to defeat that colossus in a void battle to open the amorphous material, which gives you a chance at the listed rewards. A lot like Warframe's void relics. These boss battles were okay. The arena is the same every time, literally the same every time, but the mechanics for some of the bosses were kind of cool, like Stunning Beauty's Eye of Sauron thing that would damage you when in line of sight. The biggest problem in these fights is the lack of mobs that spawn in the arena. A lot of the characters in this game have abilities that rely on getting kills, and when it only spawns 2 or 3 mobs every minute or so, it's really hard to get that ball rolling. This exacerbates the next issue: these boss fights have a time limit, and if you don't kill the boss in that time limit, you get nothing. I would like to see these boss fights expanded upon with more variations of the arena, more mobs in the fight so you can get your abilities rolling, and getting rid of the time limit, or at the very least, extending the time limit. I'm sure more of these bosses are in the works, but I would also like to see them not punish you as hard for being close to them so you can use more abilities on them. Those were my main bad points. I do have a couple other minor things. I wish there was a mantle system. Jumping and grappling can be annoying when your toe hits an edge and you fall straight down. Also, some of the enemy prefixes and variations are just straight messed up. Whoever came up with some of these was having a bad day, because there's these enemies that spawn an elemental orb on top of you when you hurt them. This can literally kill you instantly. There's a mini-boss that siphons your HP to heal itself. There's enemies that stop you from using your abilities, some that make other enemies immune and then regenerate on their own. They don't explain these variants at all, and they can spawn all at the same time in higher tier missions, which can make things damn near impossible, so less of that would be nice. So overall, if I were to give this game a rating out of 10, at face value with this beta, it would be a solid 5 or 6. I will be playing it on full release because I think it has potential to be really good, but it could also easily flop. Now, some of you are going to hit me with the "it's just a beta" argument, and while yeah, it's just a beta, and nothing against the devs at Nexon, it's just hard to believe that things are going to change drastically from the way it is now. We have been burned by so many betas over the years, and definitely recently, that were more or less finished products, and we go in believing that they'll improve and change a lot, only for it to release a couple weeks later exactly the same. I'm not saying that's what will happen with this, but I'm going to be wary and just wait and see how things end up. The big saving grace here for me is we don't have an actual release date, so things can change and delays can happen. If this was slated to release in a month or 2, I would be way more worried, but as of now, I am cautiously intrigued. So, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing, liking, hitting the bell, and checking out my live streams and TikTok. If you want to support me and the content I make, you can check out my Patreon or become a member on this channel, and until next time, have a good one.